Hey everyone, this is Dr. Corey Glenn with Blue Sky Bio, and I wanted to show a quick preview of a technique that we're working out right now on Blue Sky Plan. And once we kind of have everything dialed in, we'll actually integrate this into the software. But what this is it accomplishes a few things. One, we're going to be generating a centric bearing device. So if you've ever done dentures, you know how sometimes you can have a difficult time relating the patient's upper and lower jaws into the right bite. Some people just kind of bite all over the place when you tell them. And so trying to get them in the true centric position, and then furthermore trying to adjust the vertical up and down is sometimes challenging. And so what we're going to show in this technique is one way that you can do that via a centric bearing device that can just be 3D printed. But additionally, we'll be showing how you can use this technique to actually do first visit just a lip ruler reading and a couple of primary impressions. And then second visit, you'll be able to actually try in a, we'll just call it a wax try-in. Really, it's a printed try-in that gives the patient an opportunity to verify aesthetics, verify occlusal plane, all of those things. And then simultaneously at that second appointment, take your master impression inside of those 3D printed try-ins, and then also get your centric record. And so this will make more sense as I go along in the process. All right, so as you see here, we have just a couple of primary impressions. We don't have a vertical record. We don't have these things articulated right now, and that's okay. We're gonna overcome that via the second appointment. So the first thing you always need to do in a denture type case is that you need to align your models globally to the skull down here in the bottom left of the 3D window. So let's start out with our maxillary cast. We're going to take the upper model. We're going to align it manually. And so I'm going to hide my lower model for the moment. And what I'll do is I'll just spin this thing around until it coincides with the position of the head. Now, one useful tool for that is using the grid. So if you turn your grid on right here, you'll be able to now get this thing positioned a little bit more closely. And a really important step that I'm going to do right here is that I'm going to align this maxilla based on what's known as the hip plane. So the hip plane is the plane created by the triangle from your incisive papilla and both hamular notches. Now, this is a useful plane to know because in about 80% of people, the hip plane coincides to their occlusal plane, or at least it's very close. And so if that's the case, then we can generate a maxillary initial proposal for a denture and be able to try that in on the second appointment, even if we didn't have vertical dimension records. And so you'll notice as I'm moving this around, I'm trying to make the vertical portion of this grid pass right between the incisive papilla and the mid-palatal suture. And so I can tell that that needs to be taken over just slightly here. All right, that looks good. So we're aligned on the midline. And then we need to make sure that to orient this in the horizontal and the anterior-posterior plane, that we want to align this horizontal component to their hip plane. Okay, so here's your hamular notch, incisive papilla. Now I'm just eyeballing this, but I'm going to bring this right down onto this plane. And as you can see, right here I'm passing through hamular notch and incisive papilla. I want to make sure that that is consistent from one side to the other. Again, that's going to hopefully coincide to their interpupillary line. Looks like we could maybe come just that way slightly. Okay, and that looks good. So in theory, we ought to be able to now take a set of teeth and occlude them parallel with the occlusal plane, parallel to this horizontal component, midline passing through the vertical component, and we can generate a maxillary setup based purely on these primary casts. Okay, now the one other thing that we don't know, is how far down to put it. So, you might put in some teeth that are parallel to this, and that gets your occlusal plane, but how far down do I build them? Is the occlusal plane way down here? Is it way up here? And we don't really know that, okay? So there's a couple of general indicators that you can use for that. There's a lot of literature that relates the position of central incisor and incisal edges down based on the incisive papilla. And so, for example, you might, as a good starting point, you might go 7 millimeters down vertically from incisive papilla to locate your incisal edge. And then on the forward component, like how far forward, 6 to 7 millimeters, or alternatively, you're generally pretty close if you'll just drop the facial surface of your incisal edge to be right under this mucobuccal fold, and that usually gets you pretty close. Now, to make my tooth setting a little bit easier here in a bit, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to make this where I can align the teeth right on this plane. So these squares right here just happen to be 5 millimeter squares. And so if I go right there, you can see I'm going up 5 millimeters, 6, 7-ish, okay? So that will tell me now that if I go into the denture module and if I set my occlusal plane right on this, hopefully that's going to give me a really close proposal of what a maxillary denture should look like. And we can just print that in its totality and use it both as a custom tray to get your master impression and also hopefully just an aesthetic preview. And ideally it would be perfect and you would go with it, but if not, it's very easy to just start grinding on that almost as if you would with a wax rim, but you can just do it with a high-speed handpiece or your stone model grinder, and you can adjust the occlusal plane in whatever way you want. If you feel like you need to lengthen it, you can do that as well. Okay, so we've got the maxillary cast adjusted into position. Now we need to turn on our mandibular. Now we don't even have a mush bite in this case, so we have really no basis of knowing where to put this. And so all I'm going to do is to just ballpark this. Okay, I'm going to pull the mandibular model over. I'm going to spin it around. And I can just eyeball it to get it somewhat close, okay? At least I guess I need to look at it from the top here. So about right there, I can pull it over. And I have no idea how far up, down to put this, so I'm purely guessing here. Just based on the looks of it, I'm going to say that maybe this needs to come downward slightly and anterior. Now obviously if your models are impinging, that's a pretty good indicator that you're not at the right position, but you should probably align your retromolar pad where the plane is passing through the same position. Okay, so I'm looking at this line right here, and it looks like it's right in the middle of the retromolar pad and coming across right in the middle of that retromolar pad. So hopefully we're at least pretty good in that component, but I don't know how far forward and back, nor do I know how far up and down. And that's okay, because we're not going to worry about that too much for this one. Basically on the bottom, we're just going to make a record base. So with this done, let's now jump over to the denture module. Go over here, click denture. And now you can see that we're in the denture module. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a maxillary setup. I'm not going to worry right now about any mandibular dentition, okay? Because I don't have any basis to know where to put that. So let's just choose one of the libraries of teeth. You'll need to use the virtual teeth for this process because you can't print the teeth if you go with physical teeth here. You would have to actually grab some denture teeth. So I'm going to select all the maxillary teeth and add these selected teeth as a chain. I can spin this around, zoom in, and then push shift and left click to drop that dentition in. Okay, now we can globally position this chain of teeth. And remember, because we aligned everything to the hip plane, we know that on our setup we're pretty much just going to be putting this thing right along the horizontal component, and that's already adapting pretty nicely. Can maybe tilt it up slightly. And then remember that on our how far forward to go with our incisal edge, we could either count down or count forward from incisive papilla 6 or 7 millimeters, or alternatively just drop it where the facial surface is right under your mucobuccal fold. So I'm going to do that. And this gets me my general position for this maxillary proposal. I need to get the midline where it's centered right on the vertical component, because again, I aligned that. You know, this will not account for if the patient's got an asymmetric face or anything. We're just going off the skeletal landmarks on the maxillary cast. Okay, so now looking at this, we can turn our plane off. We can turn off the move the tooth chain. And what I want to analyze is, let's suppose that there was a mandibular dentition, let's suppose that we were going to have lower teeth. You know that you want your lower teeth centered right over the top of the ridge. And if we've at least aligned this where it's somewhat close, we can eyeball this and know that we want our posterior occlusion sitting directly on top of the mandibular ridge. And if that's the case, then this maxillary dentition looks a little too constricted to me, right? That would put our teeth way over to the lingual of the ridge. So we can just turn on the tooth chain. So show and hide tooth chain. And let's just visualize this. It needs to be expanded out. And so I'm going to hide my mandibular jaw for a second. And I need to expand this. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to lock it at the centrals. And I'm going to hold shift, swing this out like a barn door. Now you can also look oftentimes at your maxillary cast and get a good idea of where their previous canine was. And so that looks like it's probably pretty close for a canine position. Maybe bring it in just slightly. And I'm also looking here at the overall scale of the teeth. And to me, the scale looks like it's a bit too big. And so I might go back and scale these teeth down just slightly. Okay. So if I go back to move entire tooth chain, you've got a scale slider. Let's scale these down ever so slightly. Okay, that's about where a second molar would belong. Maybe a tiny bit smaller. Okay, let's go with that. I'm going to now need to, I should have done this earlier, because when you scale it, that's going to screw up your planes a little bit. So midline still looks good. The plane needs to tilt just a hair and maybe come down a hair. And then what's going to change the most is, again, the facial positioning. So I need to pull the teeth out just a bit. Now again, you may do this, and you might do the try-in and decide, man, these things look like they're way too small. And if so, no big deal. It's just printed. You can try it in, and you'll be able to go back and reset the teeth more appropriately for your next one. Okay? So I think maybe I overdid it just a little bit. Let's expand the teeth slightly. Again, align the midline. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's turn the tooth chain back on. And let's get this conformed to where we think the ridge should be. Again, the mandibular's just been kind of arbitrarily placed. But now, looking at this, the canines are in the right position. Remember, we went to that point, so I'm going to lock the canines. And now the posterior segment needs to be sitting right over the top of the ridge. Okay, so we could turn on some transparency here to see through this. All right, I need to bring this back. All right, and let's look at that. Now, if I'm even in the right general ballpark of where this mandibular cast belongs, that looks like it would put the mandibular teeth sitting pretty much over the top of the ridge. So this is going to be my final tooth proposal. I shouldn't say final. This is my initial tooth proposal that we're going to print out, and we're going to treat this like a wax try-in. So let's go ahead right now and make a monolithic upper try-in. I'm going to do that by going to the denture panel. I'm going to select the upper model. I'm going to say this is a maxillary denture and create the denture. You can identify the undercuts at this point. Let's set a insertion path like you generally would do with a maxillary denture, coming in from the front and going upward. It should be pretty much straight up and down, side to side. We could block out the undercuts or not. It's really not a huge deal. Let's block out all the undercuts. So if I was to do that, I would slide this undercut slider here all the way to 0. All right. I'm not going to do a posterior palatal seal at this point. This is again just for a try-in. And let's click next. That's going to generate your path of insertion model, and you can see where those little undercuts have been blocked out. Now let's think about what we're doing here. Remember, the goal here is just to get an initial aesthetic try-in, and with that aesthetic try-in, we'll be able to evaluate aesthetics, plane of occlusion, all of those things. But I also am going to want to do a reline impression inside of this to generate my master model. Okay. Because this was primary impressions just from an alginate. It wasn't border molded or anything. And so I need a little bit of space for my impression material. So let's take the offset, which is the space between the denture base and the tissue here, and I'm going to take that on up to 0.5 millimeter. The denture thickness, we can leave it at 3. I typically am going to take my gingival smoothness on up to the top, and now I can begin defining my denture base. Okay, so let's take this and start defining the boundary. Okay, I'm just hitting the shift button and dropping points with the left mouse. And then when you get to the last one, you're going to need to close the contour. So if you ever get an error that says you must define a closed contour, what it's talking about is you've not closed the loop here. You've got to take this dot, hold shift, and drag it into the first. Now you got a closed loop. All right. So with this done, we could refine this anywhere that we need to. But I don't have to get too picky at this point. Again, we're gonna be border molding inside of this. So borders can be adjusted way back, or you can add to it with your PVS or green stick compound. So I'm going to click next. So here's my initial gingival proposal, and as you can see, the borders are overextended. I'm not terribly worried about that right now because I can trim that back after printing. That's still a little bit of a buggy step that we're working on, is getting a better border to this denture. But what we're going to do now is just some really rough, fast festooning. Okay, so I'm going to use my smooth tool. I'm going to smooth out some of the roughness of the contours. The goal here is not a perfectly festooned try-in, like you would expect to get back from the lab. It is just a preview denture. Okay, it's for use in helping you to evaluate the occlusal plane, the tooth position, incisal edge position, all of those things you would normally do with a wax try-in. And again, hopefully with just the parameters that we did input, we're going to find that we're pretty darn close, and close enough that we could forego a true wax try-in or printed try-in. If we have something that's close enough, then we can just make note of any changes that need to be made, and when we scan all this in to make the final, we'll be able to implement those changes without needing to do an entirely new try-in. So I'm just going over and smoothing this a bit without taking a lot of time to do it perfectly. I do just want to spend a little time getting the gingiva heights correct. And so if I look at this one, that needs to be brought back slightly to expose more tooth on that lateral. And for our purposes, that's going to be good enough. So now I'm going to finalize this. I click next, and there's no need for a tooth reduction coping, so let's finalize. Okay, so it's done processing. Now you've got two options here. You could export just the base here with the subtracted sockets so that you can print teeth in white and base in pink. Just for simplicity, and because this is just more or less for a records appointment and just an aesthetic verification, I'm going to do this as a monolithic. And so what I'll do is go up here to File, Export Data. And the teeth that need exporting are already going to be checked on. But the denture-fin, that's the one with sockets. If I'm going to do it as a monolithic, I want to do just the one that says denture base. So I'm going to export this. Alright, so that one is done. Now the mandibular one, we have no basis to know where to set teeth, and so we're going to go back, and on that one we're pretty much only generating a record base. So let's turn off all these models. We don't need those visible right now. Really the only thing that we're going to need is the lower model, and then everything else can be turned off. Turn the transparency back off again. Now, in order to build a record base, you're going to at least have to have one tooth, and so I'm just going to grab some random tooth here. Actually, let's do two teeth, and we'll add those as a chain, drop them in, and then I'm not even setting them. I'm going to just go on and now make a lower. It's going to be a mandible. Let's create denture. Again, identify your undercuts. That looks pretty good. And click Next. Now offset again, I'm going to take up to about 0.5. Gingival smoothness, let's take to a max because this is purely just for, for a record base. Okay. Next. Oh, I didn't draw the contour. So let's I'm obviously being sloppy here because I don't really care about borders. Those are all going to get ground around on and then border molded. Alright, and there's the gingival base, and really I don't even need to proceed with the process at this point because this is all I was after. Okay, so let's export it. File, Export Data. It's already going to be the one that's visible right here, and I do not need these two teeth. Alright. So now let's go and open those files in Meshmixer. Okay, so we've got these files now open in Meshmixer, and this is where it gets really cool. This step is not yet added to Blue Sky Plan, but we'll test it out, and if everything works as we expect it will, this will be something that we can add to the software. So if you'll remember, we've got this based on the hip plane and the anatomy of the maxilla, we can assume that this is going to be a really good aesthetic preview try-in for a pretty good majority of the cases. And if it's not, if the midline is off, mark it up with some pencil, grind on it, do whatever you need to do, and then those changes can be implemented when you design the finals. Furthermore, these are both your custom trays where you can take a reline impression. So the last thing that we need to accomplish is that we need to get the vertical dimension of occlusion, okay, and that can again be very challenging. So if you've ever used a centric bearing device, what we're going to do is we're going to make a centric bearing device that we can just directly 3D print here. So I'm going to go ahead and import these files, and Baron Grutter actually came up with these. They're a really cool idea. So here's what he came up with. We have the nut and then the bolt, and we'll open those up and pull them into Meshmixer. So here are the objects, and as you can see, it consists of a little plate with a threaded screw through the middle of it, and both of these can be 3D printed. Now we need to move them over in position to our record bases. So I'm going to control select both of these because they need to be moved in unison. We can transform that, and now let's pull this over to right in the central area of the mandibular base plate. Okay, so the mandibular is where you're going to generally have the most problems because record bases tend to want to come unseated. And so we want this device to be centered directly in between the mandibular ridge, both upper and lower. And we'll position this to where the little rounded end of this screw, if you see right here, this is the centric bearing device. And so the patient will be able to skate around on this, and then Barron designed this such that you can take your Blue Sky thumb knob, you know, like our 048 and 050 hex drivers have, and you can use that to screw this if you don't want to just do it by hand. And so you can raise the vertical dimension by increasing this and raising that up, or you can lower the vertical dimension in the same manner. I'm going to go up a tiny bit more with this, and so we'll be able to capture vertical by just going up and down with this. And what we need is something on the opposing for that pin to occlude against, and I'm just going to do that by grabbing a primitive shape. So if I was to go up here to Meshmix, you can go down and there's one of a square. I'll pull that in and just drop it out here, and with uniform scaling checked, I'm going to click change the dimensions to 4, and that will change everything to 4. Okay, sorry, I had a phone call there, but what I've done is I've scaled this down to a 4mm cube, and I'm going to push this up into the pallet. Now, this is going to become the strike plate that the centric bearing device hits against. And so what I need to do is, now that I've got a 4mm thickness, I need to stretch this thing out. It needs to connect across the pallet. Okay, so I'm pulling this across. I just pull it over until it impinges into the teeth. And I'm going to bump it up just a little bit because I don't want to cover any occlusal surfaces of the teeth. And then I need to stretch it anterior posterior. Okay, so we have something like that. And now if I wanted to, we could turn off the lower so we can see a little bit better. And we have this, and this needs to be pretty parallel with the nut mechanism. Okay, so you look and you can see that that's parallel with that. So what I'll do is that now that that is in place, I'm just going to cut this. I'll do a Control Z, undo that. Let's accept, and now I'm going to plane cut it. So I'm going to cut off that corner that's going out of the teeth, because again, this is our aesthetic try-in. We don't want anything sticking out of the facial of this denture. And that looks like that is all going to print together. So if I was to Control Select, we can combine these, and now I have an aesthetic try-in with a strike plate, and this will all get 3D printed in just white resin. And then finally we can look at the lower record base, and the lower record base now needs to be connected in with the bottom. Okay, so let me turn off the top one. It's somewhat connected here, but I'll feel a little better about it if I stretch some supports off that connect this back part of it. And so what I'm going to do here is grab my sculpting tool and use the inflate brush. I'm going to take the size down somewhat, and let's just pull off a corner of this. So I'm extruding that off, and there we go. That's connected it. Repeat over here. There we go. And if you aren't sure if that's connected, you can inflate a little bit off of that. All right, so now we just need to combine these two files. Okay, so Control Select, Combine. And now what we have is 3 different STLs. Okay, we've got the lower record base, and you can take this thing, you can do your impression inside of it, and so do a good master impression, border mold it, all that fun stuff. And then you can do the same thing with your upper. Border mold this, get a nice master impression, trim your borders, green stick compound, whatever you want to do there. And then finally, we've got both of these two components, and we can take our 3D printed screw, And this screw can go in and we can close the patient down with both record bases in place and start adjusting their vertical. So adjusting it to where they're in the right position with their jaw. And when you think you've got it, you can basically tack these together. Maybe take a little flowable resin. Let's say you've raised this screw half the distance. You could take some flowable resin and just lock it into that position, and now just let the patient sit there and skate around on it. I'll even take a black magic marker and color in this palette, and that way they can sit there and skate around on it for 5 or 10 minutes, and you're going to generate this little turkey foot. What you'll end up seeing is a pattern something like this. This is where they go in protrusive movement, this is where they go into laterotrusive movements, and this little central point that they always come back to, that is the centric point, that is centric relation. This is just using the Masad trays, which have been just bonded onto these. And so the idea here is that we can do a similar type of thing, but one that we can print in conjunction with their try-in. And then once you've located that little central point of the turkey foot, you can put a tiny notch in there, and that way when they close in, the ball is going to just stop in that one spot, and then you can fill all of this interocclusal space with bite registration paste, and that now becomes your final records. Hopefully you verified the aesthetics, the occlusal plane, and now you've captured vertical dimension, and you can take the whole complex, which is luted together with bite registration paste, and you can scan it with any desktop scanner. That gets you your buccal bite, and then for your upper master model, you would scan the internal of this. That gets your upper. Same with the lower, and then you'll be able to reference, assuming that it was a good try-in, you'll be able to reference these teeth positions from the buccal bite when you're designing the next denture. Or let's say if you decided that you think the midline is a little bit off, you would be able to reference these teeth and move it accordingly to however it needs to go, or make changes to the cant of the teeth. And so it really allows you to accomplish a lot, so that you can do first visit primary impressions, second visit the aesthetic try-in with centric bearing device and vertical relation, third visit deliver the final with really good confidence that you've gotten a perfect centric record and you know exactly where the teeth belong.